Well, good evening. My name is Gabe Brodbar. I'm the director of the NYU Reynolds program in social entrepreneurship. And I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to the first event of the 7th annual NYU Reynolds Social Entrepreneurship in the 21st Century Speaker Series, an evening with Maker Faire co-founder Dale Dougherty and Chris Anderson, editor-in-chief of Wired magazine. I'm really excited for tonight's event for a couple of reasons. One, I just learned that this is the first evening event in what Mayor Michael Bloomberg called official New York Maker Faire Week. Did I get that? Maker Week. So first evening event. Congratulations. You're all participating in that. So I'm also excited because both Dale and Chris are really pioneers in this movement. And I know tonight we're going to learn a lot of insightful and interesting things about the maker movement, about the democratization of technology, and why this is so important for this particular moment in history right now. Why did we ask Dale and Chris to come to a speaking event about social entrepreneurship? What does the maker movement have to do with social change? I guess in the interest of full disclosure, my trajectory into social entrepreneurship really started as a kid, as a maker. In the late 1970s, there was certainly a different name for it then, but I certainly fit the profile. I was into model rockets, I was into model airplanes, Lincoln Logs, Legos, bricks, blocks, and all kinds of simple electronic gizmos. And to prove my pedigree as a reformed maker, I was cleaning out my attic and I came across one of the things that I made as a kid, right? And it's a briefcase alarm, right? I guess there was an epidemic of stolen briefcases in the late 70s, but the idea was you would push, and I really hope this works, you would push this red button, a little light would go on, and if someone took your briefcase, it worked. An alarm would go off, right? And now, this didn't change the world, shockingly enough, right? And I wasn't some kid genius. I was one of millions of kids across the country that had a passion for making things. But there wasn't a place to go. There wasn't a community to meet with like-minded folks. There wasn't a place to be inspired by others or to inspire other people. There wasn't any place to learn how to make a cooler mousetrap or even a cooler briefcase alarm. And that's really what the maker movement is all about. As Dale and Chris are going to talk about tonight, as human beings, we are all inherently makers, whether or not you want to admit it. As kids, we make forts and tree houses and clubs. People like to cook. People like to tinker with their cars, their bicycles, their motorcycles, what have you. We are inherently all makers. And the real beauty and the reason that there is a relationship between the maker movement and social change is this very simple but very powerful element in that the maker community brings place. It provides an opportunity for all of these people to come together, to inspire each other, and to learn and grow as makers. A couple of quick housekeeping things, the way this evening is going to work. Both Chris and Dale are each going to present for about 15 minutes. Following that, they're going to have a conversation with each other that we get to eavesdrop on. And then after that, we're going to have at least 30 minutes of a conversation with all of you. I encourage all of you to keep an open mind, to participate in this conversation, both here and online. If you're tweeting, you're welcome to use @NYU Reynolds and hashtag NYU SOCENT. And I hope all of you this evening leave not only thoroughly convinced that this is in fact a real movement that's got real implications for each of us, but also more in touch with the maker in all of you. So without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming to the NYU Reynolds stage, Chris Anderson.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a lovely story. That pretty much summarized, I think, both of our speeches brilliantly. It's a privilege to be here, and my sense is that in this audience is the generation that's going to prove just how big this movement can get. What I hope to do in just these 15 minutes is at the end, convince you that this is the third digital revolution, and possibly the biggest yet. The first was the personal computer. Changed the world, Jobs and Wozniak, Apple II, and all that. The second was the web, and bigger yet. The first put a desktop computer in everybody's hands. The second put the world in everybody's hands. We could all be publishers. We could all spread information. And the third takes all of that, the desktop and the web, and combines into the world of real stuff, of making things, the world we actually live in, an economy that's many times larger than the digital and information economy. So I think this is a pretty big deal. But let me just start with like one slide that sort of states a thesis, and then the rest will be pictures. This is just it. That we basically spent the last 20 years doing an amazing thing online. We found a new way to work together, new ways to innovate. We build communities. We build on each other's work rather than reinventing the wheel. And it's changed the world. And now we have the opportunity to apply that to manufacturing, to physical products, to everything else. The web for everything else. That sounds pretty interesting to me. I called in the subtitle of the book, which is coming out actually next week, is The New Industrial Revolution. That's a very big phrase, and I think I kind of have to earn it a little bit. The first industrial revolution is generally considered as starting actually around the same time as the American Revolution, 1776. And it began with tools, things like the spinning jenny, and later on steam, and ultimately electricity. And fundamentally what it did is it replaced muscle power with machine power. It allowed us to be less beast of burdens and more operators' machines, and amplified human potential. When you think of so we had spinning looms from, fairy tale times, and all the spinning jenny was just multiple looms. But just that ability to go from one task to many, again, amplified human potential. But over time, it came at one cost, which is that you had to move to the machines. The machines were factories, and they centralized labor, and they concentrated labor around big companies and the industrialists. This, by the way, was fantastic for culture and society. If you look at sort of human progress and prosperity and quality of life, it was just this kind of asymptotic, this inflection point. Our lifespans extended, child mortality went down, many diseases were eliminated. Turns out actually that living in the rural England where the walls were damp was actually kind of hard. And although the cities, you think of them as being dark satanic mills and all this kind of stuff, they actually ended up creating what we now know as modern sanitation and concentrated healthcare, et cetera. It's great for society, great for the world, great for population and all that. But it did mean that we were working for the man, in a sense. We concentrated the world around the means of production, as Marx said. So very good for the world, but not great for choice. Kind of eliminated a lot of the diversity and concentrated it around big factories. That was the first industrial revolution. And that kind of went from the late 1770s to, you can argue it went all the way through. There's a lot of debate actually where industrial revolutions start and how many there were. And some people think the assembly line and Henry Ford was its own. But let's just take that, through the manufacturing age, the industrial age. Then we had the second industrial revolution, which I'm going to call the digital revolution. And rather than just show you a personal computer, I'm actually going to show you two essential elements. Yes, we had the personal computer. But I want to advance from 1977, which was the Apple II, to 1985, which was the launch of, right after the Macintosh, was the launch of the Apple laser writer. What's interesting about the laser writer is that it's a printer. And it's a printer that actually spoke the same language as the biggest industrial printers of the age. Now, you may not think of this as a big deal. It was kind of expensive. Not a lot of people had them. But it introduced a concept of desktop publishing. And when you think about desktop publishing, it's kind of a radical notion. Publishing, right? factories, printing plants. Don't argue with people who buy ink by the barrel. Railway cars, printing paper, et cetera. And then it took that word publishing, i.e., something you can't do, and then added the word desktop to it. In the same way that the PC took a word computing, which was mainframes and things that were owned by governments and big companies, and added the word personal to it. And just that simple addition of the personal, the desktop, was mind-blowing. It expanded the range of participants. It wasn't the best printer in the world, but it was the desktop printer. It was the personal printer, and it meant that you could do it. And what was interesting about it is not that there was, that these people were printing the same things, is that they were printing different things. It opened the world to the full expanse of ideas and creativity and imagination of anybody out there. But that was to make one of something, or two, or 10. It wasn't mass production. Then we attached it to the network. We attached it to the web. And that was, blogs and ultimately social networks and social media and all that. And then you could not only prototype, print, but you could publish. You could broadcast. Then you could do everything that the 20th century media companies could do. And that is the world that we've inherited. And that is, my first book, The Long Tail, and all this was an incredible explosion of creativity, a richness, a diversity of culture. So that's what happens when you allow people to make one or make many. You completely democratize the means of production. OK, so that's basically two or three decades. Now, what about today? Rather than a laser printer, we have a 3D printer. This is the new MakerBot replicator. It's pretty much the same concept. What a printer does, a paper printer does, is it takes pixels on the screen and puts them into ink on paper. It takes bits and turns them into atoms. And all a 3D printer does is just does the same thing, but with a third dimension added. But that changes everything. Now you can make physical objects. Today you make physical objects in 1 or 2 colors and plastic. Pretty soon it's going to be all the colors of your inkjet, plus new materials, plus integrated electronics. Maybe someday it'll be biology. That's kind of amazing. But you can only make 1 or 2 or 10 of them. That's not manufacturing. You're not competing with the factories of the world. The second element, the equivalent of the blog, if you will, is the introduction of cloud manufacturing. You can do it right now as you're sitting here, although, listen, but don't. But you can go to a site called Alibaba or any other sites. There's many like this. And you can just upload a file, and factories in China will start working for you. I've done this. I did a little project with my children to make a blimp. And we decided people liked it, and we decided to make a kit. And when you're making a kit, you don't want to buy the parts retail. You want to buy them wholesale, because to keep the price low. So I went looking for wholesale electric motors. And I went on to Alibaba, and I was looking for wholesale electric motors. And it turns out they said, well, actually, what we do is we make custom motors. What would you like? What kind of shaft length? How many windings? What kind of magnets? And I was like, wow. I don't know, but I kind of worked it out, and they worked me through it. And I just click, click, click. They took PayPal, and 10 days later, I had a box of 1,000 electric motors, which had cost me sort of like 40 cents each. And I was like, oh, I just got robots in China to work for me. Now, I used to live in China in the 1990s, and I can tell you back then, if you wanted factories in China to work for you, you had to fly to Hong Kong. You had to get an introduction. A facilitator or a fixer would make an introduction to a factory. You'd then go across the border. You'd have a very awkward series of conversations. Wasn't quite clear, what they did and who you were. Ultimately, you would end up with dinner. You'd have to eat fish eyeballs. There was like some drinking, karaoke. It was really a humiliating hazing ritual. And maybe after that, they would agree to do the deal, work with you. You'd get a letter of credit, a bank transfer, et cetera. And like months later, the box would show up. And I'd just done literally 20 minutes of clicking PayPal, and the box showed up. That, I couldn't believe it. And I was like, I'm not even a company. I'm just a guy with PayPal and an idea. And I just got a factory to work for me. And that was when the light bulb went off in my head. I can make one, or I can make many. I can be an inventor, or I can be an entrepreneur. And that moment, it was like the blog moment. The first time, you guys are all too young, but the first time you sort of publish something, and it's like, you press the publish button, and it's like, oh, publish. I mean, you actually used to have to be a publisher to press publish. You know, stop the presses, start the presses. And they just press publish, and poof, the whole world can read it. Maybe they won't, but they could. And the same thing now with manufacturing. So we've kind of, those two essential elements we've now duplicated with real stuff. OK, so here's my story. When I was a child, I would be sent to Los Angeles in the summers to spend time with my grandfather. This is Fred Hauser. He was a Swiss immigrant, worked in Hollywood in the 1920s and 30s, and by the time I knew him in the 70s and 80s, he was a pretty old guy. But he was, by day, he worked on film transports and tape loops and things like that. And by night, he dreamt up things, and he invented. And it was drawn on paper, and this is what he invented. It was the automatic sprinkler system. By the way, if you put a Swiss engineer, essentially a watchmaker, in Los Angeles, this is exactly what they will invent. They will put a watch on top of a sprinkler. And that's what an automatic sprinkler is. So he invented that, and we got the patent on it. And this thing filled him with sadness. He hated patenting. It was expensive. He didn't like working with lawyers. It took forever, et cetera. But he had to patent, because it was the only way you could get stuff out into the world. And you can't make your own stuff. You have to patent it, license it to a manufacturer who will then turn it into a product that they will sell. And this is actually what they sold, was the Moody Rainmaster. And I remember going, I guess it must have been the late 70s, and the company was still, the patent was still in force, and he'd visit the factory, and they couldn't actually quite remember who he was. And there was this old guy who came in. They said someone finally remembered he was the guy who had invented the thing that they'd licensed and were ultimately making. They were very polite, but it was clear that they didn't need him. That he was an inventor, but he wasn't an entrepreneur. He didn't control the product. He did fine. He made good money from it. Our little tiny family fortune came from it. But there was a slight sad element, but that you can't follow your idea all the way to the marketplace. You have to give it up to somebody else. This is me at I think 4 or 5, learning how to invent things with Grandpa. And this is me at 12, learning how to use a metal lathe, which is a beautiful instrument. That summer, I remember that summer really well. He said that this summer we're going to make an engine, a gasoline-powered engine. And I was like, cool. And he said, I've ordered the kit. So I show up, and there's a box there, and I think, this is awesome. OK. I know what kits look like, right? The inside, there's lots of parts. They're numbered. There's glue. There's instructions. And inside the box were 4 blocks of metal. And this blueprint, this really gnarly blueprint, was folded about 6 times. And I was like, Grandpa, where's the engine? And he says, it's in there. It's in the blocks. It's our job to get it out. And that's what these beautiful machines like a metal lathe can do. It's the way a sculptor says, the way you sculpt a figure is you take the block of marble and you cut away the parts that aren't the figure. Well, he cut away the parts that weren't the engine. And now this was, I was blown away. It was a magical experience. And yet I forgot about it for 30 years. And the reason I forgot about it for 30 years is that I couldn't do that. I don't have skills. I'm not a machinist. I don't know how to use a metal lathe. I spent one summer with Grandpa, but I didn't have those skills. And even if I had an idea, there's no way to make it real. There's no way to build that prototype, much less go into manufacturing. Now there is. The big breakthrough for me was things like 3D printers. The recognition that in the same way that, we don't think about this. You go to your word processor and you go to the file menu, you pick print. And then something comes out. You don't know how it works, and you don't really care how it works. You print it, and out it comes. That's like 500 years of incredible innovation. That used to be really hard. You used to need degrees and apprenticeships and years of training to print. And now it's just a menu item. And the same thing, that's with a 3D printer. Now it says make. It's just like that. They've turned the entire Industrial Revolution into a menu item. So that was my story. This is a movie that came out a few years ago called Flash Your Genius, which is a warning as to not do this. This is like the lesson of the 20th century. Don't try to become a maker, because this guy and this is the movie scene. This guy invented the intermittent windshield wiper, which is the one that pauses when it's not raining very hard. But he made a mistake. He decided that he was also going to be an entrepreneur. He was going to make it and fabricate and build a factory. And so he mortgaged his house and built a factory, or tried to build a factory in 1961, 62, 63, 64. It takes forever to build a factory. He's nearly bankrupt. '64 goes by. He's still not done. Leaves the factory in the film. It's raining. He turns the corner, and the new 1965 Mustangs are turning the corner to be unveiled, and their windshield wipers pause. And he realizes that his idea has been stolen, and he is ruined, and he goes insane, and the movie follows his descent into madness. It's very entertaining. But that was the lesson. Don't you dare try to be an entrepreneur in the physical world. Manufacturing is not for you. It's for big companies. At best, you can patent and license, but don't try to make. Today, this is what a factory looks like. This is a tech shop, the one in Silicon Valley. There's now 5 or 6 of them around the country, and hundreds of makerspaces, and we'll talk more about those later on. But this is you don't need to have a desktop 3D printer, et cetera. This is like the gym model. When you think of a gym for monthly membership, you have access to better machines than you can afford, bigger than ones than you want in your house, and things like trainers and other people who will inspire you by also working out. And this is the same thing, but for making. So this has the 3D printers and CNC machines and laser cutters and all sorts of fancy tools and classes and lots of other people doing exciting stuff. This guy's doing a wireless communications module for the smart grid. This guy's doing a vapor deposition chamber for synthetic diamonds. In the back, they're building a lunar lander, because why not? And this is it, right? So this is the gym for making. And this is just a spread. Dale, actually, you showed a slide, and you had fewer dots on your slide. So this is the latest map I could find of makerspaces or hackerspaces. They're like everywhere. I was in Lima, 2 weeks ago, and there's one there. And this is awesome, right? These are the engines of the new economy, if you will. So the funding engine, and again, Grandpa would have to go and get a bank loan if he wanted to, or mortgage his house, again, if he wanted to build a factory. Now you go to Kickstarter. And Kickstarter and other crowdfunding sites do this amazing thing. What they do is, it's so simple and yet so powerful. They do 3 things. They, move money forward in time. So when you think about that, it's crazy that when you make things and produce them and then sell them, you get the money at the wrong time. You get them at the end of the process. But you needed all the money at the beginning of the process, when you were doing the R&D and prototyping and getting inventory and tooling and building up the product line that's going to eventually end up in the retail channel. So by just taking pre-orders, they move money to when you need it at the beginning of the process. Second thing is that they do market research. If you don't hit your target, the product probably wouldn't have sold. They've de-risked innovation. They've de-risked entrepreneurship. That's a fantastic gift. And finally, they build a community, the backers in the comments. And this is the Pebble watch that came out at the same time as the Sony smartwatch. You probably didn't hear of the Sony smartwatch, but you might have heard of the Pebble watch. They raised more than $10 million. This is like 4 kids in Palo Alto. And they kind of outcompeted one of the biggest electronics companies in the world. And what's cool about building a community is that the community had lots of ideas. They wanted these things to be more waterproof, so they made it more waterproof. They wanted it to be Bluetooth 4, not Bluetooth 3, so fine, they did that. They wanted different colors, they did that. And now this community feels that they're part of the product. They feel they're invested in it. They feel there's some kind of joint ownership between customer and producer, and they become the best marketing engine ever. These are evangelists for something that they believe in. They're not pre-ordering a product. They're investing in the creation of something superior and new and with a little bit of them in it. And that's the web innovation model applied to real stuff. So when you get a 3D printer on your desktop, when you download the software, you're a designer. You're a small d designer. You may not have a degree in industrial design, but you don't need one either. And in a sense, in the same way that when we got that Macintosh and that LaserWriter, we all became publishers, and we made this horrible dog's breakfast of font amalgamation, and we made ugly pages, but then we got better, and we learned. And all those hundreds of years of terms of art, the kerning and the fonts and the leading and all that crazy stuff that you used to be an expert to know, and we just kind of learned it eventually and got better at it. And we became publishers, small p, if you will. We're now designers, small d. And this is what we do. So this is one of the free. This is the way. This is the word processor, if you will, of making. This is one of many free CAD tools. This is Autodesk 123G. I just want to show you something interesting about it. This is, I decided that it was kind of, my grandfather invented the automatic sprinkler system. I thought, as a thought experiment, what would Grandpa do today? How would you invent the automatic sprinkler system today? And by the way, I don't have a lawn, so this was a little abstract. But I said, well, OK, so what do I know about the automatic sprinkler system? It would be, today, it would be open. It would be web connected, probably Arduino-based. You would be able to use it on your phone, et cetera. So anyway, so I invented something called Open Sprinkler with a bunch of other people. And it did all that stuff. You know, it's like if it's going to rain tomorrow, then you don't need to sprinkle today. So we can pull that weather down. You can control it on your phone. By the way, there's tons of better web-connected sprinklers out there. But this one was mine. And you know, I think somebody out there will probably do a great job of it. It was really kind of an experiment for me, but this was the enclosure. You know, it was like the first thing I designed in CAD. I just wanted to point out that right here, there's this menu item that says Make It. And you pick down the menu item, and it walks you through this little wizard that kind of gets you into like materials choices and volume calculations and cost calculations and your various kind of, you know, all that stuff that you used to have to fly to Hong Kong to do, and they've turned it into a software wizard. And in the end, by the way, then I then sent it up to Shapeways and printed it out. It turned out my walls are too thin, which is good to know before I order lots of them. But I mean, again, it's one of those kind of, you know, hairs go back up on the back of your neck. It's like the entire global supply chain has been turned into a menu item that says Make It. Cloud, the factory in the cloud. And it's free, by the way. I mean, the making isn't, but the software is. So this is what so now we have 3D printers at home. We're on our second generation. And this is what my kids do. My girls are really into The Sims, which is kind of like this dollhouse game. But we're kind of strict about computer time. And they after 2 hours, they have to move on to the real world. And so we're just like, play with your real dollhouse. And I'm like, oh, it's not as cool. Can you buy me some new furniture? And I say no, because it's really expensive, and there's not very much choice, and it's the wrong size. But I said, but we do have a 3D printer. My children grow up in a house with a 3D printer. And so they say, well, let's go to Thingiverse and find out what's there. And it turns out there's a designer who goes by the name of Pretty Little Things, and she puts up the most beautiful dollhouse furniture designs for free on Thingiverse. And so we download it, and we then scale it. And this, by the way, is a 4-year-old girl who did this one. And then she prints it out like that, and then she paints it, which is a lot of fun. And so now the dollhouse is full of 3D printed furniture, which is just what they wanted, and they were free. And our boys, of course, do Warhammer 40K mechs and paint them as well. So this is, if you're a toy company out there, this should fill you with terror, right? These are not as good as what you can make with injection molding and all that fancy stuff, but they're personal, and they're just right, and they reflect my children's unique needs, and they value them more than anything that we would buy in a store. And they're only going to get better. So, you know, there's a bunch of free apps out there. Tinkercad's on the web. You don't even have to download it. It's really good. And I'm going to end with just this thing. Remember the Apple slogan? Rip, mix, burn? Well, this is where we are right now. Rip, mod, make. What do I mean by rip? You can download a free app on your iPhone or iPad called 123D Catch, which just allows you to just take the camera and go click, 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 move around something, and you've scanned reality. It's called reality capture, but you've basically scanned a physical thing. You could then change it, move it, adjust it, make it smaller, bigger, add things, and then you go to that make item. So you scan your head, modify it, and turn it into a Pez dispenser. We saw what Rip McSpurn did to the music industry. Just think what this might do to physical things. So here's my slogan. Atoms are the new bits. The revolution that we started, the personal computer, grew on the web, is now going to get even bigger in the physical world. Thank you. So I have the great pleasure at this point to introduce the guy who started this all. In 2004, 2005, Dale Dougherty, who was running a division of O'Reilly, recognized that something was happening before anybody else. And he came up with a name for it, the Maker movement. and Make Magazine and Maker Faire and all this. So present at creation, the originator of all this, Dale Dougherty.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and having Maker Faire coming up this weekend. I think Maker Faire is sort of such a kind of real instantiation of all of this. It's one thing to see it on slides, but it's to see real people standing next to the things that they make and talking about them it's just a wonderfully enriching and optimistic experience. So I'm going to talk about building maker communities here a bit. Eric Raymond used this phrase to describe the motivations of open source developers. And he said they do it to scratch their own itch. They don't do it to satisfy some other group of people or social good or anything. It's just they've got something they want to do, and they're able to do it. And I think this really is at the core of making and the sort of DIY culture we're in. Makers are enthusiasts. They are people that love to do what they're doing, and they're mostly amateurs. They might have a professional job by day, but this is something they carve out and do because they really enjoy it. I started Make Magazine really on this idea that hobbies were kind of important and weren't maybe they were going to come back. I guess that's maybe the idea there. But this enthusiast was someone who liked to do stuff. And we have gardening magazines and cooking magazines that are for gardeners and cooks and woodworkers, and they're about what to do. Our technology magazines, for the most part, have not been that about. It's been more about what to buy. And so I really wanted to focus on projects, and that led me to Make Magazine. And then about a year later, we started Maker Faire. I thought there were such interesting people. It would be fascinating to bring them together, to meet each other, to see what they did, to share their projects. But they also had something to say, I think, to a broader audience. But I didn't know that when we started. And it has grown, amazingly. But, it really isn't new. Making is something that has been it's really in every culture in different ways, but more recently, it was expressed through magazines like Popular Mechanics. And, honestly, we do the same thing that they're doing. This is in 1961. We still have articles in like how to build a go-kart. I don't know about scientists on the brink of hell, but make your own printed circuit boards. If you're a maker today, hey, you think that's kind of new stuff. That's what their article looked like. And I guess partly if you read this, the process is easy and readily obtained materials make this a fascinating hobby. Right? This is 2007 from Make Magazine, and we're kind of doing the same thing. And obviously, we're really not reading, but it just comes from the same place. It's easy to attain professional-looking results, and it's the same process. There are other ways of doing this, making a printed circuit board, but this particular technique is kind of has been the same for 50 years. But it's still new to people today. And I guess part of my theme tonight is making is hard to do. It is not this, we're all today users of technology, and technology is getting easier to use. But making is still hard. Making is getting easier to do, but it's much harder than just being a user. I mean, look at today, this is a Georgia Tech student's work area. He's got a 3D printer. He's got 2 computers doing different kinds of 3D work. He's got an egg bot. He still has, a screwdriver and a wrench and some spackle or some other kind of thing over there, and a copy of Make Magazine. Thank you very much. This is the workspace that they're working, both physical and digital, and going out and putting things together and making. It is a process that is more complex than other things. So this has kind of led into a maker movement. And to be honest, a good idea is one that moves beyond your control and other people take it places you want. So I don't necessarily know what this maker movement is or why it's grown up. And I'm also, I thought tonight's talk is a way to explore this in other contexts. So I've hit on this idea that, like, let's look at marathoning and compare makers to marathoners. Marathoning, there are more marathoners today than ever, right? It has grown in terms of participation hugely. And I'll give you an example. But if makers are closer to being marathoners, users are close to being joggers, right? They do things that are kind of simpler and achievable. But you know what fascinates me about marathoning? It's difficult to do, right? And it's still difficult, no matter what we add into it. Boston Marathon's 120 years old. For the first 80 years or so, it's got 300 people running. It maybe gets up to 1,000. But look starting in the late 60s, something happens to really drive participation. The spike is sort of the 100th anniversary of the marathon. And they actually begin to control how many people participate. But even so, you know, the number of entrants in it really grows. And it's not unique to Boston. I mean, that's the Berlin Marathon, and you can see 286. I looked up the New York Marathon. It started in 1970. 127 people started, and I think something like 47,000 finished it last year. Finished, not just entrants. So, you know, really amazing numbers of people doing something that's very difficult to do. And, but I'd say that what interests me is that growth in marathoning really comes from amateur participation, not from professionals. These are people who are running, in a sense, you can kind of see this here. There's probably the same number of elite runners as there were 50 years ago, and they have them at the front of the pack. They get to start first. The amateurs are the whole mass that goes all the way back there. And you know, they are running, one, to finish, to see if they can finish, and maybe to improve their time. They have their own personal goals. And that's what speaks to me about making, that people have their own reasons for doing it. And they set those goals. So I kind of, you know, thinking marathoning as a social movement, kind of built this timeline. Now, I'll go through some of the pieces of it. But, you know, in 1970, there's 1K, you know, Boston Marathon entrants. You know, by 2009, there are 10K just women entrants in the Boston Marathon. And that just gives you some idea here. But it roughly almost overlaps with the, well, you know, kind of move it a little bit. If you start the 1980s of the personal computer movement, you know, we're seeing a similar just sort of amazing growth in that. One of the things that I'm kind of thinking about here is that events matter. Events take the personal and make it public. They give us a chance to see what we're doing in the context of other people. So this is, you know, obviously Maker Faire this week. You know, we've grown from like 15 to 20,000 people in our first event in the Bay Area to, you know, really over 100,000 people just coming, and thousands of makers. And it's not maybe the equivalent in all ways like marathoning, but people are coming out, they're participating, and they get recognition and other reasons for doing that. Yeah, that's probably my, well, actually, this is the Maker Faire slide. So, you know, events can be replicated. So there wasn't just the Boston Marathon. Marathons can be done in any city. Well, Maker Fairs are now in about 60 cities worldwide this year. So we help to do that by kind of coaching people on creating one, but we don't organize 58 of those 60 fairs. This is one in Seoul, Korea that I visited this summer, and you know, just a relatively small one in an art gallery, but had this wonderful thing. It's just gratuitous making here, but it's just these beautiful dolphins that are controlled by a cell phone. You know, you can set the timing and the speed and all this. Just a beautiful little thing that you'd find. But I mentioned this earlier. So what are the things that were driving marathon? Greater inclusivity. I mean, they kept women out. I mean, it was mainly a male. It was a male sport. In 1970, they admitted the first women, and then the disabled category began to increase, and so those are parts of reasons why they grew. I think we're trying to do something. Making is predominantly a male sport today. but I believe we're seeing some inroads there, but there's a lot more to do. This was our first kids issue this summer, and this was an issue earlier in the year with Carol Riley, a surgical roboticist, on the cover. But I think if there's one reason why marathoning has grown, is that there's better training. And there's local training. That when you tried to run a marathon, you didn't just show up to the marathon. You joined a club, and you went through a program to do this. And I think to some degree, we start thinking about, like, what are the steps involved in learning, say, making. And we have things online which show you step by step how to do this. But here in Atlanta, as an example, this is a 17-week program that you sign up for if you're going to participate in the marathon. So they've provided really structured on-ramps for people to become marathoners. So, and I think that's a really important thing for us to look at. So I think the equivalent of clubs in our area are really makerspaces and hackerspaces. They organize the tools and expertise, materials. They are really a kind of environment where you could go to learn, to try something, and again, almost starting small and sticking with it. They have classes. This is Artisans Asylum in Somerville, Massachusetts, introduction to mold making, casting. You can go and take workshops and begin to learn stuff that I think is, the interesting thing to me in comparison to marathoning, these are a lot of things that people would say they couldn't learn or didn't learn in school, and they thought it was beyond them. Sometimes when we just sit people down and they learn to solder, they're amazed that that's something they're able to do. These makerspaces exist as freestanding, but we're seeing them in science centers, libraries, even in the basements of churches and museums. But we don't see them as much in schools, and that's become kind of a personal interest of mine of, can we get this back into high schools? Almost reinventing what shop class used to be, combining with a computer lab and an art studio, and make it into something fresh and vital, and give kids something, an opportunity to learn not just the technology, but really the practices of making. And being able to get kids involved at younger ages and a more diverse group at a younger age is really important. So I'd say a couple other things here. Just, Nike becomes a big driver for a movement like this. They get on board with it, and, but here's how they started. Really, it's a making story, right? A guy says, I'm going to build faster shoes, and it ought to have a pattern that looks like my waffle iron, right? And he literally, on a Sunday morning at breakfast, creates what becomes the first bottoms of shoes that do this. So his waffle sole. But where did I lose something there? I might have. But I think tools and technologies also come in here to be drivers for this, and Chris eloquently talked about a lot of this. But I don't think it's just technology. I think it's partly what people want to do and see themselves doing it on this personal level. Back on Nike, this is an ad I found on their site, but this to bring inspiration and innovation to every athlete in the world. It's kind of a very tech message, but I love this part. It's if you have a body, you're an athlete. So I mean, companies come in, perhaps like I have, to say, we're all makers. I mean, we have a self-interest in this, but we could believe that only a few people are makers, or there's only a few athletes, but we have this sort of democratic urge to think it spreads to everybody and engages everybody on some level, and I think that helps broaden participation. So, in wrapping up, just kind of, we enjoy the challenge of making because it is difficult. It's not completely easy to do. And more importantly, it makes us seek out other people because we need their help. And it helps to, I think, form community and build community because we have to find that expertise in our community. But I think if we want to particularly look at, look at what marathoning has achieved, we want to think into the futures. How do we create better training for a more diverse and expanded audience of makers out there? And so lastly, my goal, I guess, for the maker movement really is this phrase from Walter Gropius at the Bauhaus, and it's kind of a makery picture, but it represents a number of different pieces of work from the Bauhaus. And he calls this sort of common citizenship of all creative work. And in a sense, our goal in this community is to encourage the participation of more and more citizens. Thank you very much.
So now we're going to have a little chat. We'll try to debate. We'll try to find things to disagree on.
Yeah.
For 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll take questions. I was struck by your point about how being hard is intrinsic to the social compact, and I'm going to do a historical analogy. Do you think so? The beginning of the personal computer,
right,
and the homebrew computing club was hard. And what were computers for? So you could program them.
Right.
So it sounds like you think that 1977 was like the moment when the personal computer revolution took off, whereas I was talking about 1984 and the Macintosh when computers got easy. So what happens if suddenly, today, this week, there's a bunch of launches of new 3D printers, and their selling point is that they're easy.
Right.
Does this undermine your movement?
Not really. I mean, look at who's building the 3D printers today. We just did a 3D printer shootout up at our offices, and we had 17 different models. And I would ask the makers of these largely Kickstarter-funded projects, like, what's your background? And I used to work in the restaurant business. It was like nothing really related to them being an engineer even. They just thought they could figure it out. They went online and studied things, and I think there's a part of this where this won't last very long, but right now there's a window in which we can look at a lot of different designs and see a lot of different approaches, and maybe one of those off-the-wall approaches will introduce a new feature, introduce some capability that nobody else thought of.
Do you think the web is the right analogy? I mean, I would say that the web got rich when it got easy. The HTML page that you had to hand code was a limited creativity. The blog made it easier.
But I guess what I'm trying to distinguish is, here's an iPhone app, easy to use, right? But making an iPhone app is still a challenge, right? I mean, not everybody can do that.
Right.
And so early on, I was able to create a web page without much technology, but you go and look at what's going on in these systems today, and it's certainly gotten a lot more complex. We were doing straight HTML, and we thought, hey, I can read that, I can understand it, and now, there's a lot of code and other things running on the back ends.
And yet, I mean, so there is the act of making, and there's the product themselves. The ideas, the kind of realization of creativity.
Right.
I would argue, and I'm sort of teasing out differences for the sake of debate. I would argue that what's much more interesting is the products that would not have existed in the old days when you had to be skilled or professional, etc. So I mean, these 3D printers that you're describing, that yes, it's true that they start on Kickstarter, but they're being sold as being something that just make and press the button and it just happens, and it's all about what you do with it rather than the machine itself.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that the 3D printers, exactly. I mean, we always say things are going to be easy, but like in our shootout, the software's still pretty hard to use, and I don't know that everybody is ready to be able to do this. There's a certain sense that the makers are like a first wave, that they're willing to spend, and this is kind of what I saw in Make someone who's really technical and enjoys technology, they're willing to spend hours, countless hours, doing something that other people say, that's a waste of time, that's frustrating, I don't like to do that. But they see it as something that they're willing to do and dive in. I always said that the first when MakerBot and others start coming along, makers are buying 3D printers not because they know what to do with it. And I think it goes back to those personal computers. We don't know what they're good for, but I want one. And the way I get one is to build it. And really by building ones, they began to figure out some of the uses for it that did drive adoption.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the killer app is going to be invented by somebody in this room or my children. In the same way that the technologists, invented TCP/IP and HTML or whatever, but But we the users, figure out how to fill it with
Yeah.
you know, our ideas.
The thing I'm trying to get at too, in a way here, is even entrepreneurship is becoming part of a culture that seems accessible to people, right? Like these 3D printer developers are thinking it's possible for them to do that, whether it's raising capital, figuring out how to do manufacturing, or even get attention and build a market around it. They think those levers are things they can, you know, grab their hands on. But with your grandfather's example of saying, you know, he had a good life, but some inventors have really miserable lives.
Exactly.
Saying, I had this great idea and I never could do anything with it. And I think that is driving our moment way, is that whether you're 15 or 20 or 80, you can take an idea and do something real. You could at least get it to that prototype level and put it in someone else's hands and say, what do you think of it? That's pretty exciting stuff.
Let me drill down a little bit more on this, sort of the why now. So you'd argue that this was a kind of a long arc of history, kind of a growing social movement within America that preceded the web, preceded technology. It was really driven by something, you know, something more sort of democratic in our country, or maybe the world. You know, and yet I see it. I certainly agree with all that, but definitely feel that the technology accelerated it and made it new, made it relevant in a way to the web generation in a way that maybe it hadn't been before.
Yeah, I mean, I think the technology is, particularly the social nature of the web, has amplified this. That, you know, sometimes we weren't able to do that thing because the person in our we didn't have anybody nearby that knew this stuff. You couldn't walk in and find that person, and you can find that online. You know, I think I just sort of use the past a bit like, in many ways, a tinkering revolution led up to the personal computer. You know, and I kind of, and one model I have in my head is like, we just got so obsessed with the personal computer that no other tool mattered. You know, and into the fact that, first of all, it was getting that tool and getting it right, and then creating things on that tool and distributing them, you know, over networks. And I think the insight I had a bit with Make was that, you know, the computer wasn't the only interface to the world that we had, and computers were moving out, sensors and other things were moving out into the world, and we would think about programming this room as well as programming an application, you know.
The Internet of Things.
Yeah. You know, and these things, you know, like you talked about the sprinklers, we begin to think that everything has intelligence, not just our desktop or laptop computer.
There's another historical analogy. I started in the science world where the internet began, the web was invented at CERN, a physics laboratory, and it never occurred to us that this would be used for anybody but scientists. And then, you know, along came Wired and a couple others, and it's like, this is a social revolution, it's going to change the world, and they were right. What got interesting when it got in the hands of other people, and today, you know, when you think of you know, who's going to make this room smart, and who's going to create the Internet of Things, and who's going to, you know, ensure that the sensors capture all the interesting data coming off our body and the quantified self. And the answer is going to be, it's probably not going to be big companies. It's probably going to be the people this weekend at Maker Faire.
Yeah, well, let me ask you that question, because I think one of the real things that's driven your interest in this is the ability to kind of, you have a product, you have a company, and I really like the story around DIY drones.
Oh yeah, so this is really why I got into this. I'm trying to get my kids interested in science and technology, and just consistently failing, possibly because I'm trying. And so one weekend, we got these products in at the office at Wired for review. We got a Lego Mindstorms robotics kit and a radio control airplane. And I thought this was going to be the best weekend ever, right? On Saturday, we're going to build a robot, and on Sunday, we're going to fly a plane in the park. And so Saturday, we dutifully, kids like Lego, so we dutifully, you know, get out the kit, follow the instructions, and, you know, I spent all morning building what's called Tribot, this little three-wheeled robot that sort of, you know, hits the wall and goes back. And the kid's like, you're kidding. That's it? That's what I mean, they've seen Transformers, right? They know what robots are supposed to be. Turns out Hollywood has completely ruined robotics for children. You just cannot live up to CG. So that didn't work. So then the next day I was like, okay, well, on Sunday we're going to go to the park and fly a plane. That's pretty cool. And it goes like straight into a tree. Okay, I went passive tense there. I flew it straight into a tree. And if that weren't embarrassing enough, I then climbed into the tree to get it out, which was just mortifying to the kids. And they're like, okay, that's it. We're not doing any more geeky, sciencey things with you, Dad, because it just sucks. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, God, if we'd made the Lego robot fly the plane, it would have done a better job than me. And I was like, wait, actually, it came with a gyroscope, an accelerometer, and a compass, and you'd had it's like, oh my God, you actually probably could get the Lego to fly the plane. So I made the kids get together, and we built a Lego autopilot. Around the dining room table, it kind of almost worked, and we built a better one, and we eventually built a Lego unmanned aerial vehicle, Lego UAV, which is now in the Lego Museum in Billund, I'm very proud of. It also turns out, by the way, that the autopilots are basically cruise missile controllers, and they're regulated as munitions by the State Department. And technically, we weaponized Lego, which is pretty cool. Anyway, at that point, I realized that Lego was not the right answer, and I needed to kind of get smart on this. And so I just decided to sort of, I would have blogged, but it was later, so I made a social network, and I was just basically going to share my ignorance. And I just started saying, I know nothing about this, and I started asking questions, and people started answering my questions, and they shared, and they taught me, and then other people asked dumb questions, and they taught them, and eventually we built a community that was kind of doing a homebrew computing club, but for drones. What could possibly go wrong? And then they were like, and then we were like, okay, we've done it. It's great. So go to build your own printed circuit board, exactly what you say, and you have to go to this parts supplier and download and buy the components and then solder them together. And people were like, could you possibly do that for me? Because that sounds really complicated. And then we thought, well, we'll have to make kits. And so we sat around the dining room table and I soldered them, and that went really bad. Do not put the 6-year-old on quality assurance. That was a real mistake. Turns out she's not as good at counting as we thought at that moment. Anyway, so it became clear I had to start a company. And there was this guy on the site who was just doing this amazing thing. He was flying a helicopter with a Wii controller that he'd hacked. And he said, there's this cool platform called Arduino. And I was like, we should build a company around that. We did some projects. And I said, do you want to start a company with me? And he said, okay. And I said, tell me something about yourself. He was Jordi Munoz. He turned out to be a 19-year-old from Tijuana. Just graduated from high school. And today, he is the CEO of 3D Robotics, a multi-million-dollar drone maker. We make more drones than the US military. And he's now 26, I think. Still hasn't been in college. And if you think back, 10 years ago, if the editor of Wired was going to start a drone company, what are the odds that he'd end up with a Mexican teenager? Mm-hmm. And yet, here we are.
Yeah, and I've heard you say you would have thought you'd get someone from Stanford or Berkeley.
Right.
And I think that's part of what is really exciting about this is there really are these, when I go into hackerspaces and makerspaces, I see talent and I see projects there that, I don't think I'd see other places. And sometimes they're dropouts, sometimes they're retirees, or a lot of times I find they're people that love engineering but just didn't fit into a corporate engineering world, and they're excited to be able to do this independently. And they're just tinkering away, coming up with things. And in some ways the maker world is like an open R&D lab where I think if companies were smart, they'd start paying more attention to what that sort of innovation in the wild is that's going on out there and figure out how to connect to it and harvest it.
So I want to ask you one more question before we take questions from the audience. You emphasized amateurism. Thank you. And I emphasized entrepreneurialism.
Yeah.
Is it like, the web, you could argue, is half filled by professionals and half filled by amateurs. They coexist in the same marketplace. You read.
They use the same tools.
They use the same tools. They compete equally for your attention. Yeah. Is the same thing going to play out in the maker world?
I kind of think of, at least my view of seeing this from the Maker Faire perspective often is that someone shows up with a project they've dreamed up in their garage and people like it. And they say, can I buy it? And, buy it? I've just made it for myself. And I've thought of them as accidental entrepreneurs that and we still see is that they have the product chops sometimes, but they don't have sometimes the business idea. And they have to go out and figure that out. But we see a lot. There are Actually, I should just say there's a number of really vital maker businesses in New York here.
A ton.
Adafruit and MakerBot, to mention a couple. But you wouldn't think that Manhattan would be the place where someone's locating a new factory.
I've thought a lot about that. It's not. I mean, also Kickstarter and
right.
And Etsy, and I think actually, just to kind of complete the circle of our conversation, I think the reason that's the case is obviously New York is not a low-cost labor, so you wouldn't build traditional factories, but because production has been reduced to something that's almost as simple as digital fabrication and a menu item, what becomes more important is design.
Yeah. And
New York is the design leader of the world.
Yeah, and I think you had it on your slide, the democratization of creation, and which is kind of what I'm getting at too, is that these tools become used for personal expression. You may start off with that, but you realize you can do stuff and create things. And again, O'Reilly, when we started with those laser printers, and we could do books on our own without. That was exciting. We found a niche doing computer books, and we've kind of walked through those phases that you did. So anyway, let's break. If you have questions, come up to the mic, and we'd be happy to try to answer them.
Hi, awesome talk, really interesting. I just have a question about this economy of the future as 3D printers become more ubiquitous, and all these supply chains become disrupted. How will the creators of the future kind of maintain their connection to their creations and ensure that they get proper compensation or credit for the things they create? So I guess the concern that's underlying this is, will piracy become a huge threat to the maker movement if it becomes something more than a hobbyist pastime? Thanks.
Well, today there was the Open Hardware Summit all day down on 21st Street, which was largely talking about this very subject. Piracy is probably not the right word. I mean, these things are typically, openness is intrinsic to the innovation model. You give away a little and you get back more in return. And when you give away a little, you do give up a little control as well. But over time, and we have 20 years of open source software on the web to show us, over time it tends to pay off. Does it feel good when a Chinese cloner, copies your design you just spent, 6 months and thousands of dollars on, and in 7 days, and sells it for half your price? No, it does not feel good. And this happens to us with every product we release. But when I pull back, I realize that we do get the dividends. That 99 people rip us off and 1 person improves on the product, and then that improvement is also open. And ultimately, when you pull back, you can see it's an innovation engine that's superior to anything we've seen before. So it makes you feel a little queasy. It's a little sort of unorthodox, and it's not right for everybody, but it seems to work.
Yeah, I would just say, the new default is sharing, and whereas the old inventor world was protection, and we see some benefits from that sharing. But it's still a default. You could change that default to something else. I think where it's going to be interesting is as 3D printers proliferate and we look at what's the IP of the things that we're printing on them. Imagine that there's sort of parts for something in your home, and that manufacturer doesn't supply the design files for that, but someone else starts to do that. And who owns that, and is that legitimate? It's going to be, what are the logos on things? All that kind of stuff is I think, going to bring this back. Let's go to another question here.
Hi, thanks so much. There's a thesis that's floating around out there. I've heard it articulated by Peter Thiel that we've had a burst of innovation in the virtual world, but not a concomitant burst of innovation in the material world. And I think Thiel's conception of it is that perhaps that's because the material world has become heavily regulated. So regulated that in order to get the permits or the permission to do things, you expend all your costs there. And I wonder what both of you would think about what should law do to regulate the future of the 3D printed world? What does products liability look like? What maybe should it or shouldn't it look like? And maybe the more extravagant possibility or idea as far as how finance is being remedied by crowdsourcing through Kickstarter, can law be perhaps remedied through crowdsourcing?
Big questions. I mean, I don't think we can answer them completely, but I just want to mention that, I mean, I have some experience in this. There is no more regulated industry than drones. And it turns out that, that the open innovation model gives us all sorts of, we route around it. It turns out there's an exemption for public domain. And open source qualifies, because in the 1970s, when they did this, they never imagined that someone would put a drone in the public domain, but yet here we are. There are regulations for recreational use. For flying drones. So the biggest companies in the world aren't allowed to fly in the United States, but my children can. I keep invoking my children. They hate that, by the way. But the point is that anybody can do it. There are, we were talking a lot about this morning, there are exemptions for selling, when you sell to an end user, you have to go through all sorts of FCC stuff. If you're actually selling components that go to like to someone who's a developer, you don't necessarily have to go through that. And product liability, if you give away a product, you're not subject to the same product liability. So again, the open innovation movement has found all these ways to route around. I mean, by the way, big companies love regulation because they've got lots of lawyers, right? It's a barrier to entry. And what open innovation does is it finds the gaps and then just sort of flows like water into those bits where the regulations are the lowest. Not to say that they won't get higher over time as we threaten the traditional industries, but at the moment, and remember, we're a global market. So one country's regulations don't influence the overall, spread of innovation around the world.
I mean, what you said is really interesting, and we could probably can't spend enough time on it. But I think liability is one of the big areas of law that makers will end up either changing or at least, in the sense like there was a great copyright battle of the internet. We probably didn't win legally, but we sort of run morally, and it has helped to cause some change. But what is product liability when consumers are making the product? And the notion of consumer as sort of a protected state is different when you're thinking about makers. So, but practically, it's things like spaces. Whether they're being zoned as manufacturing because they have 3D printers in them and light industrial and that kind of stuff. We're seeing makerspaces run up against those kinds of issues. But at the same, governments have these two heads. One is the economic development groups are trying to recruit people and spaces just like this and become hubs for innovation. And then, their safety and other folks are coming in and closing them down. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. I would love to believe that sort of educating city, groups. I was in a panel in Oakland on industrial arts. Like they feel they've been sort of kind of run out of the city, and just the way they run out of San Francisco. So let's go over here.
I'd like to pick your brains, the two of you, on a controversy that's recently occurred in the maker community involving the Replicator 2 and sort of the Thingiverse, with the Replicator 2 now being a closed source item, and also the concept of ownership in the Thingiverse with MakerBot's industry saying that those designs which are in Thingiverse are owned by those people. I'd like to hear your opinions or what you think the repercussions of such a action might be, or those kinds of things.
So are you more interested in the Thingiverse or the MakerBot?
Let's actually go with the Thingiverse, because I think that's a bigger issue.
I think that was a misunderstanding.
Yeah,
those terms of service have been in place since 2011.
And they're not that uncommon.
I think that was a
sites.
misunderstanding.
Yeah.
The Replicator 2 is more interesting.
Yeah.
I think we don't actually know quite exactly what's going to be open, what's going to be closed. I mean, Bree and his team they understand very well both the social and the legal compact here, and they're not going to violate any terms of license. But as they grow bigger, they feel that they do need to protect some things. And the general policy is you give away what helps the community. In other words, you give away stuff when it matters, and you don't give away when it doesn't matter much to the community, but it matters a lot to your building a sustainable business. So I think the main controversy is that they didn't communicate this very clearly at launch. I'm pretty confident that they're going to find a path that I think most people will like.
And it's kind of a certain point in this community's life where we're kind of moving from just pure idealism to some pragmatism around this, that these ideas of openness are negotiable, and we should be clear about them. My only concern on this is when you're recruiting the community to do work and then you change the terms on that, the contributors have a gripe with you, a legitimate gripe that they felt like they don't want to lose the work that they contributed freely and openly. And it's not clear that MakerBot is going that far. They're basically saying we're wrapping some of our own proprietary layers around open source. And honestly, Google does that, and other companies do that, and we don't take them to task.
Oh, hello. So my question is about education. Like, are there certain things you guys think that we should be teaching in the schools to help the development of creativity in the school of the children?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think, you know, again, when you think of these as tools of production, for creativity, you know, most kids are still working with pen and paper in schools, and to be able to work, you know, across these tools, both digital and physical tools, I think it's exciting. Kids want to do this. You know, it's not going to be easy to get them into schools. I'm trying, and I have a goal of through this mentor program of getting them into 1,000 high schools, and partially as a model. But there are teachers out there that want to do this. Students want to do this. Parents want to do this. We do have some resistance in kind of traditional education, perhaps, but I think we're almost at a turning point where people are feeling like they need a better way. You know, they want creativity, but they in some ways often they don't. You know, they don't really know how. You know, you really have to open things up a lot more for them to be creative.
If we could do one thing, you know, if this movement has one lasting value, it's to introduce the word design into high school curriculum. We have computer class where they learn PowerPoint, and we have art class, you know, where they paint and they sculpt and draw. And you know, if you put them together and you end up with design class, you know, if those 3D printers do become easier and more like the laser printer, and you just add 2 3D printers to the existing computer lab you already have, now it's a design lab. And you know, to think that your kids, you know, the generation of kids can sort of believe that anything they can imagine and visualize on screen. By the way, kids are fantastic at 3D spaces on screen. They play video games, and then they take it home. I think that could completely change the game. You've got a generation of people who think that design is something they can do, and you know, to put design into the school curriculum means that you're training a 21st century skill that people could actually build jobs around.
So just one quick question.
Sure.
How much is a 3D printer now?
Well, the new Replicator 2 is like $2,200 or something like that. But you know, there are small ones, and they're kind of running from about $1,000 up. But again, this was a technology that has been around since 1985. The patent dates in the same year as the laser printer from Xerox PARC. You know, and you know, it's available industrially like $25,000, $30,000. So you know, what's happened as a result of this is it's just much lower price and opening. You know, the first laser printers were $30,000. They weren't cheap either. Okay, let's see if we can answer questions more quickly. So we've.
My question is in regard to 3D printing prices, actually. So, what will it take? What kind of steps will need to happen in order for it to proliferate into a more mainstream idea? And so, similar to a laser printer.
Let me ask the audience: how many of you own a 3D printer? Okay,
That's a shock.
all right. How many of you want to own a 3D printer?
There we go.
All right. So that's kind of your answer. There's some gap between what people can afford today. I mean, the manufacturing process and other things. But, you know, I would say that what's interesting to me, and I think really the great thing that MakerBot did, is they sort of were the test case that people really do want them. The industrial market thought they would just cannibalize their sales for a higher priced item, and they weren't interested in the consumer market.
It will happen faster than it did with physical printers because we have a physical printer to build on. If you think about, you know, the inkjet you probably already have is a two-dimensional, you know, CNC machine. It's got, you know, the paper goes this way and the head goes that way. You add one more dimension, one more motor, one more shaft, and you're basically laying on layers, and now you have a 3D printer. So we're going to build on everything HP, you know, has done.
But isn't it funny that the companies like HP really are sort of been absent
HP
from
doesn't
this?
get out of bed for less than 1 million units. So their problem is that they only think big.
Yeah, but they've kind of missed this on-ramp. Okay, next question.
You guys kind of touched on this a little. I'm coming from the law school. I was wondering, in the future, do you see this sort of bringing changes in the way that the maker movement interacts with the law, or is it just a matter of sort of going around it, like you said, or how do you see that developing?
We've been getting away with murder. Basically because we're small. Because we're small, we basically, we're probably violating patents. One of us would get big enough to set off some triggers. You mentioned the intellectual property stuff, but we don't actually know what copyright means. So I told you could scan reality. How many polygons is infringement? My low poly, Warhammer figure, probably okay, unless I call it a Warhammer figure, in which case I've admitted I've copied it, right? So, but these things are always worked out by the courts. Basically, some of us are going to have to get sued. And we're going to then, it's going to play out in the courts. We're going to have to fight it. It's going to play out in the courts. And on the basis of that case law and precedent, we'll figure out, what the rules are. But right now, it's anyone's guess.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing, more work for lawyers. But
Hi, thank you both for speaking. I may be taking you slightly out of your comfort zone, but what do you think is the future of e-commerce and fundraising?
Well, do you mean Kickstarter or beyond that?
No, beyond that. Barack Obama is using text message donations now to fundraise for his campaign. So are there any other technologies that you see coming into the future?
I really don't follow that area to have any great insight on it. I think crowdfunding, in a sense, is being applied to nonprofit purposes and goals as well as anything else.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Hi. When we look back to the first industrial revolution, we see both a lot of innovation and a lot of social issues coming out of that. And I'm curious if you see any, definitely we see innovation, but will there be any big social issues coming out of this second industrial revolution?
Or third, yeah. I think one thing that's kind of interesting about what we're describing here is that it sounds like very sustainable manufacturing. You're making things locally. You've shrunk the supply chains, so you don't have the same kind of carbon footprint. And because people are making things that are sort of just right for them, they might tend to value them more. So it might be less disposable. I'm obviously sort of spinning a little bit here because I want to feel that it's sustainable, but it does feel to me that it is an antidote to mass manufacturing on distant shores and all the carbon and political cost that comes with that.
Well, it's that time tonight in the church that we pass the basket around here and collect a donation. But no, actually, this is, we have coupons here. There was hopefully we'll find numbers of people that are here. We have 4 books and 6 sets of 4 passes to Maker Faire.
And 1 briefcase.
And 1 briefcase alarm, which is guaranteed for 30 minutes.
The books are signed, and signed books are also available for sale outside. It's Chris's latest book, Maker's New Industrial Revolution.
Okay, all right.
So if your number's called, just raise your hand, and we'll reach out to you.
And Steve gave afterwards. I'll pull one here. This is 740948. Okay.
Moving on, 740782. Oh, yes.
All right, we got one. That's a book. 740860.
No hands.
I wish this was bingo.
740907.
There we go. Okay, that's 2. We're going to work our way the other way. 740849.
Yeah.
No, we got 2 hands up, but it's that one. It's you, right? Okay.
They're all 740. 828. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Well here.
So were those 4 for the books?
No, I'm only at 3 now.
I've got 2, right? All right. I just read them. 760. Oh, okay.
Okay, yeah. 816. Oh, yep. Okay. All right, I'm done.
So now are we on to
it's all Maker Faire.
Maker Faire? Okay. 866. All right. Very good. And 749. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Say something. Make sure I see you. Because we'll just move on. 904. No. Okay. 878. No. Okay. All right. 827.
Hashtag winning.
All right. That's good. 723. There we go. That's 4. And let's see. We got 813. Sorry, 813. Okay. Yeah, we're on a roll here. Okay, and 803. All right. 950.
So exciting.
The last one, huh? 802. All right, there we go. Hey, thank you, Gabe. Thank you for having us tonight. All right. Thank you, Chris. Thank you.